Hello, everybody. It's a pleasure to me to restart our webinar series about computational photochemistry with our first guest of the second semester, Dr. Patrick Zobel, who is a very, very young scientist, but with a huge contribution to our field. And I'm sure you have already read some of his papers. And Patrick got his degree in chemistry in 2011 in Germany, and then a master degree in 2013. And what I have to highlight here is that he was the first in his class, during his master degree. And you can see he got the PhD degree with Leticia Gonzalez in 2018, so only 3 years ago. And then he went to Lund for a postdoc with Valera and returned to Vienna for another postdoc with Leticia Gonzalez, where he is working now. Among his research interests, I can say that he is among the authors of Open MOCAs, and he works hard and in a very good way with ultra-fast excited state dynamics, non-adiabatic dynamics of organic and inorganic molecules. That's the subject of this talk today. And something about methodology, vibrational sampling techniques. I think he's going to talk something about this topic today again. And he has a lot of awards. Among of them, I highlighted the award of the University of Heidelberg for excellence performance in the study of chemistry in 2013. Another fellowship from BASC 2020, 1 year earlier, for the excellence in molecular chemistry work. And he got also the opportunity, because he was selected among a lot of young researchers, to participate in this Nobel laureate meeting in 2017. A few numbers, we must remember that only 3 years ago he got his PhD. He has already 15 publications, our index age around 8, and one of, I think, among his papers, I think this is the most, at least for me, one of the most read papers and very interesting papers, where they demystify the Ipeia shift dilemma in CASPT2. So I think nowadays nobody uses Ipeia shift anymore due to their work published in Chemical Science a few years ago. So during this seminar, you can ask during the presentation, if you want to make place any questions, just raise your hand or write in the chat. I'm going to be following the chat. And please keep your microphone mute, and I'm sure everybody will enjoy this presentation. So thank you very much, Patrick, for accepting the invitation and being with us today. Thank you very much. I'm just going to close my window, and then you can start sharing yours. Thank you very much, Patrick.
Again, thank you very much for the invitation to be here in the seminar. So I will try to share my screen now. I think you should now see my screen.
Yes, it's arriving. Yes. Okay, we can see it.
Okay, yeah. So we welcome everyone to this talk. I will be talking about how to simulate excited state dynamics. I will be focusing on how to do this for transition metal complexes. This has been a topic that I've been working on for the last 2 years. So first of all, why are we interested in this? In general, photochemistry is a very rich field with a lot of interesting applications and problems to solve and to understand. Like, for example, how the process of vision works, or how can we harvest energy from solar light in forms of using some dye-sensitized solar cells, or also stuff that our group works on, or also Antonio worked on, is photostability or photodynamics in nucleobases, how they interact with light. So there's a lot of interesting problems to study, and I'm gonna show you 2 examples that I study later on in this talk. So when you can generally think, how can you study these types of processes? In principle, there are like 2 avenues you can go. First is you are an experimental chemist, and probably you do some spectroscopy, and then what you do is you measure some signals, and from your signals you can infer somehow what happens when your molecule interacts with light. And basically you get out some numbers when you go from one step to the other, then to the other, and then you can measure some spectra along the way to characterize the molecule while it changes its properties during the interaction with the light. And the other way is, if you do what I do, if you just try to simulate it, specifically what happens there. You try to find all the electronic states where this happens, and when energy comes in, you go to some excited state, and then you can follow the different cascades that your molecule can go via the dynamics. And basically, both approaches have their advantages and disadvantages, but I think they compensate each other very well. So actually, there should be more synergy between these 2 fields. If you do a spectroscopic experiment, you usually always study the system that you're actually interested in, which means the full system, the molecule without cutting anything off, and also in its natural environment, how you want to study it. And what you always get is also you get the exact thing that the molecule really does. Well, if you have to do simulation theory, usually you are restricted to studying some smaller systems, which means they are somehow simplified, maybe some large groups in the molecule are missing, or you don't have an environment, and also because you cannot use exact theory, always the properties to get out, they are always somehow approximated. But the disadvantages of spectroscopic experiment are that usually this is always very difficult to interpret, so that you just get some close response of a system, and then you usually only are able to find out some simplified model of the processes that really happen. While if you do a simulation of theory, you see exactly what your model does, and it's very easy to interpret, and you always get the full model. So kind of have to try to get both fields working more together to try to solve the important problems that we face. What I'm going to focus on in this talk is, of course, not the experimental part, but how to really simulate this excited state dynamics. Basically, there are different avenues you can go in principle. One would be use some kind of wave packet methods, which I'll say a few words in a moment. And the alternative avenue is to use ab initio molecular dynamics. What you always need to do is you somehow need to solve your electronic structure problem, which gives you the electronic potentials that guide the dynamics. And then depending on how much you can invest to refine your model, is you can include an environment. You can try to model explicitly some laser pulses, which are present in the experiment, but often neglected in our simulations. And you can also look at some other effects, like, for example, what happens if you in your calculations already assume you have a finite temperature, which is more closely to experiment than if you had a zero temperature. And at the end, you have to do a simulation for some time, and basically this is then also what determines the cost of the simulation. Like, what can you afford? How much approximations do you have to introduce in your model, and for how long can you simulate the dynamics? If you look at something like wave packet dynamics, or also they're also called quantum dynamics, it's basically what you do is you solve your nuclear Schrödinger equation on a potential energy surface of the electrons. What this gives you always is you always have all the quantum effects. For example, you can describe tunneling processes, but the problem is that the simulation of this dynamics scales exponentially, with the nuclear degrees of freedom that you have. So typically, you cannot study very large systems, or if you want to study large systems, you have to find the simplified models again. And what you do then is you pre-compute the potential in a grid, and on this you can solve your dynamics. But also this, before you even try to simulate the dynamics, this pre-computation, this also again scales exponentially with the number of degrees of freedom via your grid points. So also this is very, very expensive. And now what we are doing is we are going the opposite way. We are not doing wave packet dynamics, but we are doing ab initio molecular dynamics, which is also what Antonio does. So probably you have heard of some of this before. I'm still going to talk a little bit, one slide about the ideas behind it. So in particular, we use a method called surface hopping. I'm not really going to explain any details. I'm just going to say that what you do is now you don't solve the nuclear Schrödinger equation, but to simulate the equation of the nuclei, you solve Newton's classical equations. But you don't do it in classical potentials, you still do it on electronic potentials that you get from any quantum method. So this is where the ab initio part from the name comes from. Because you simulate the nuclei classically, of course, you don't really have any inherent quantum effects. Some methods can try to introduce ad hoc corrections, but I'm just going to say like there are no quantum effects. And what you have to do is you have to simulate not only one dynamics now, but you have to try to simulate several different independent trajectories that can go different ways to, in the end, mimic something what a quantum wave packet could be doing. For example, it could split when there is some electronic potentials coming close together. And then probably the main thing why we actually do this is because now you don't have this pre-computation of a grid anymore, but you can actually propagate the dynamics on the fly, which means you only always need to calculate the current geometry where you are. So all these potentials which are never visited, you don't have to calculate them beforehand, and this really saves a lot of effort. So in the end, what can sorry, one more introductory slide to the theory, and then we start with the real part of the talk. So in the end, we also need somehow to calculate our potentials, which we do with any of our favorite electronic structure methods. Typically, you can distinguish between single reference methods, something like time-dependent density functional theory or ADC2 or some coupled cluster theory, or multi-configurational methods, which examples are CASSCF or CASP2 or MRCI. And basically, they have also their strengths and disadvantages, and they are used for different purposes. And if you have a single reference method, this is restricted to having a closed shell ground state, electronic ground state, which means in the ground state, always all the electrons have to be paired. Otherwise, this breaks down, or at least gets very tricky to see if it still makes sense. Or if you have some multi-configuration methods like this, basically you can describe any type of ground state that you want. And also, if you have most single reference method, they only include single excitations. Or if you have something like ADC2 or CC2, higher order excitations are very barely described, while with this kind of multi-configuration methods, you can also describe higher excitations. So you're more flexible in the electronic states that you describe, and you're also more flexible in the processes that you then finally can simulate. So, and basically also because in single reference methods, you have to have your closed shell ground state. You cannot describe something like dissociation processes where you split the electron pair, while again with multi-configuration methods, this is possible. But the other thing is, if you look at how much this kind of calculations actually cost in terms of computational time, like these methods, they usually have a low scaling, which means you can also apply them to large systems, while these methods, they have a high scaling, which means they are restricted to smaller systems or with less atoms. In the end, if you think like, what would just one single calculation take? Probably with this single reference methods, you are somewhere between like a minute or up to a day if it's a very large system that you want to study. While multi-configuration methods, even the small calculations, they already take hours, and then you can do something, you can even go for one calculation that takes weeks just to get one number. But if you really need this kind of accuracy and you have these difficult problems, there's no way around it, so you have to invest it. So let's see than what is currently possible to simulate excited state dynamics of transition metal complexes, so what has been done in the past. Here I show you the simulation time that in studies that have been published on transition metal complexes as a function of how many nuclear degrees of freedom you included. Like we said in the beginning, if you have these wave packet methods, usually you only have like some simplified models, while surface hopping or initial molecular dynamics in general usually do to the full molecule. So some examples. Most of this, which just include 1 or 2 nuclear degrees of freedom, is you had some small metal complexes, and you would just see, if you shine light on it, which of the 2 axial ligands also dissociate. So you'd only include this kind of distances in your description. There's also some larger some complexes where a little bit of more of degrees of freedom are included, but still all these complexes here, they have typically hundreds of degrees of freedoms, but you include only up to 15 or something like this. Well, for example, here, like a small, I think it was a copper complex, 15 degrees of freedom, where you could pre-compute the potentials in a parameterized way, which I will explain in a second with CASP-2. This is like the maximum you could really do with this kind of wave packet methods or approximations to wave packet methods. Or if you go to ab initio molecular dynamics like surface hopping, you can study systems of similar size as this, but now in full dynamics. For example, something I'm going to show as my first example later on, this metal complex, which is a vanadium complex, where you can now include all 123 degrees of freedom. And yeah, just another example. So, but this can still be very expensive if you want to do all this electron structure calculations in surface hopping simulations. So what we do is, or what we can do now is, we have a way to parameterize all the potentials, which is done in a vibronic coupling model. And specifically, we just use a linear vibronic coupling model, which is a Taylor expansion of your potential entry surfaces around the reference geometry, and we just stop after the linear term. So at the end, you get some Hamiltonian, which looks like this, which describes your nuclear dynamics. And basically what this is, so we start assuming a harmonic oscillator ground state, and then we can add our excited states. So first we just shift them by some vertical excitation energy. But of course, not all excited states lie just perfectly parallel to our ground state, but they are shifted somehow. And this is expressed via this coupling terms kappa. And then maybe we have another excited state and it's also shifted. But now in these excited states, they can also interact with each other. So what we introduce now is this interstate coupling terms, and they can give you something like avoided crossings or like this typical diabatic shape of potential energy curves. And then at the end, if you want to, you can also include other terms which further couple electronic states, for example, in orbit couplings, which will give you a shape that look like this for if you had a triplet and a singlet state that interact. And yeah, this has been used for a long time already in the wave packet community, but only in 2019 this was implemented in our surface hopping program SHARK, and now it's also possible to use this linear vibronic coupling model together with surface hopping. So, and this has really opened the avenue to study larger systems with much longer simulation times. Just to give you an example of what this means, recently we collected all the different surface hopping simulations that we have ever done in the Gonzalez group and compared how expensive they actually are. And so I show you here on this side, you have again the nuclear degrees of freedom. So which, as we are always talking about surface hopping, it's every time you have the number of atoms minus 6. And then simulation cost means how much time on one CPU you would need to simulate one trajectory in surface hopping for 1 picosecond. Maybe you don't want to simulate the full picosecond, but just for the cost, we're going to show it like this. So in the beginning, we studied a lot of molecules with this multi-configurational methods in surface hopping, CASSF or CASP-2 or MRCI. You see, like typically, you pay something between 1,000 and 10,000, maybe. Even this is a little bit larger system, even up to 700,000 CPU hours just for one trajectory for 1 picosecond. So, example of the molecules would be here. Of course, you can also go to something cheaper, which are the single reference methods, for example, TDFT. And some more points. Now I see we can already go to larger systems, although we have similarly expensive computational cost at the end when we also increase the system size. For example, some metal complexes that we could study. And then also, if you use other single reference methods, like you see, there's kind of a nice trend that would predict how much you would need to spend for one trajectory for 1 picosecond, and then whatever you want to calculate, whatever you want to simulate, you can calculate how much your total cost would approximately be. But you see, like this, everything is at least some 10 to 100 core hours, even for the very small systems for 1 picosecond. But then, if we now use this LVC stuff, we can actually simulate larger systems for much smaller cost. Like, for example, this very large metal complex with several hundred degrees of freedom. Now 1 picosecond takes only 1 hour on a modern CPU, while the similar size TDFT simulation would cost like 5 orders of magnitude more. So this is very efficient, and now this can be used to study also transition metal complexes for longer simulation times, and also doing like a lot of trajectories to get good statistical averages on your ensembles. So the first example that I want to show you here is this vanadium complex, which has been synthesized by colleagues from us in Germany, and it's a near infrared emitter, so it emits at around 1,100 nanometers. And for transition metal complexes, this is kind of unusual because they usually don't have such low-lying emitting states, but for applications it can be very useful. For example, if you want to do bioimaging, then in this range you can penetrate human tissue very well, and because it's such a low energy radiation, it doesn't interact so much with our skin, so it makes really no harm. So this is a really good way for biological applications. Basically so far all this near-infrared emitters, they have been based on rare earths like lanthanides, and of course it would be nice for applications if we can substitute it with some cheaper, because it's more abundant, transition metal. But the problem when you want to study these kinds of systems is they have a very complicated electronic structure. So vanadium-3 has a D2 configuration, which means it has, if you look in an octahedral symmetry, it has a triplet T ground state, which means basically you have 3 degenerate configurations which contribute to your ground state. So it's not just one ground state, but it's actually 3 ground states at more or less the same energy. Or it's a little bit split if you think it's not perfectly octahedral, but only pseudo-octahedral. And we studied this, and at the end, this emission will be from singlet to triplet. So just not to confuse all the people who are used for this organic molecules that you always have triplet to singlet phosphorescence. Now we go the opposite way. Our ground state is a triplet, so our emitting state will be a singlet state. And for this kind of electron structure, you really need a multi-reference or multi-configuration method. And I'll show you for some examples why otherwise you cannot even describe all the states that could happen, that could take a part in the dynamics. So if we again look at our ground state, we have these 3 configurations, so representing the 3 different components of our ground state term. And then we have some excited state term where we just move one electron to one of the other metal d orbitals. At the end, let's say we choose only one configuration as our reference, which is always done in single reference methods. What could we describe? Well, we could describe all the other components of the ground state, and we could always describe some components of the excited state, but we can never describe all of them if we just use single excitations. And this also doesn't matter which of these components you choose, there will always be something that you cannot describe. So single reference methods, they always miss some of the even low-lying metal standard states. And also, there are also some higher-lying states which have this double excitation, and there, with single excitation methods, with all the single reference methods which only have single excitations, this is not something you can describe. So you need some kind of multi-reference, multi-configurational method to describe all the states, and also to describe higher excited states, which you have in this open shell metal complexes. And in this case, we also found it's also necessary not just for metal standard states, but also if you have ligand standard states. So, for example, here we have just add some pi orbitals to our complex, and then we also have found that some low-lying excited states are like this pi to pi star excited states. And basically, this looks like actually that you could just describe it by a single excitation. But then when we actually analyzed all the wave functions, what we found out there's actually a linear combination of you have 50% single excitation and 50% double excitation. So also here, if you would use TDDFT, it will only give you this part. So you're missing a lot of configurations that would correct your energies. So also there, you cannot even describe this qualitatively. And now if you want to do, so now we say, okay, we have to use some multi-reference, multi-configuration method, but can we really do dynamics with this? I mean, normally, so this is the overview, in the end. From all these excited states, like some you cannot describe at all with single reference methods, some are only barely described, and then you also miss the fact that these states should be really more or less degenerate and not written as excitations. So then you get a completely wrong qualitative picture even. Yeah, but now can we do really surface orbit? Could we really do surface orbit dynamics with this? So for this metal complex, all these state characterizations I showed you were based on K-CF calculations. We have an active space of, you have the 5d electrons and then 4 pi and 4 pi star electrons, calculated 16 triplet and 15 singlet states. And at the end, we could, how much would it cost to simulate this kind of dynamics? And if you would do like the standard on-the-fly surface hopping, and you would say, I want to calculate 100 trajectories, I want to simulate them for 1 picosecond, well, this costs already 15 million CPU hours. And this is probably more than our whole group would spend in a year. So this is not something just for one project. So this is not really an option to do this. And now, if we go back to the idea of using this LVC parameterized potentials, what we can do is we can parameterize the potentials. Now we have to do something like 250 calculations to parameterize the potentials for all the degrees of freedom. Still, this is kind of a sizable chunk of computing time, but it's only 20,000 core hours, and this is perfectly doable on a modern computer cluster. And then at the end, if we wanted to use like only the same tiny number of 100 trajectories for 1 picosecond, just to simulate the dynamics would only cost an additional 300 hours. So basically now, with this linear vibronic coupling, we have put all the expense only in this parameterization part. So as long as you can parameterize something, you can always run as many dynamics for as long time as you really want to. And yeah, because it's so cheap, we didn't just do 100 trajectories in 1 picosecond, but in the end also like 2,000 trajectories in 10 picoseconds to see what happens at later times and to get the more to get better statistical results. So in the end, this costs something like 60,000 CPU hours. So now let's see what really happens in this complex. So basically, you start in some metal standard excited states, and there is like a very difficult cascade through a set of other metal standard excited states, and there's also this kind of ligand-centered with D-contribution metal excited states. And the important thing is, so we have some intersystem crossing to the singlet states, and there's also some back in the system crossing back to other metal standard states. But in the end, we stay with like 2% of the population in the singlet states, which can then lead to the emission of the complex. And as I said, also if we look at our calculated time constant for this system crossing process is about 1.6 picoseconds, and also in time in transient absorption experiments, they show the rise of a long-lived signal with a time constant of 1.56 picoseconds. So also this looks very close. So this seems to be a reasonable description. The main pathway in the dynamics is not this. This only accounts for 11% of the derivatives, but it's actually this reaction through some other metal standard states, which just leads from the initially excited state all the way then down to the ground state. Now we can analyze the dynamics and see what happens, to see if we can learn something, and maybe tell our experimental colleagues how can they modify the complex to enhance this the phosphorescence. So first we can look at what is actually the motion that the molecule does. We found out when we looked at all these 2000 trajectories, the main motion is really that now I have just drawn all the ligating atoms. The main motion is that you elongate all the metal ligand bonds. So you go from close packing to a further packing. And what you also have is that if you look at the angles between the trans coordinating atoms, from initially they move further away from this ideal octahedral value of 180 degrees. So also they bend somehow out of plane. Now we can check where is actually the intersystem crossing happening. And this is shown by all these yellow lines. And you see that initially, when you look at the first few hundred femtoseconds, initially this yellow line is always there where the blue lines are. So initially, intersystem crossing is always possible. But then at later times, we find that, so this means that you can have intersystem crossing from your triplets to the singlets, but you can also go back. But now when we look at what do the singlet states actually do, as we see, most importantly for this one trans angle, the singlets, they go to higher values than where intersystem crossing is possible. So this is what at later times then quenches the back intersystem crossing, and this is what keeps the remaining population in the singlet states, which then lead to the fluorescence. And this nuclear motion, this also correlates to what happens with the electronic states that you populate throughout the dynamics. So if we look again at our kinetic model from the beginning, and now we figure out in the analysis that we did before, what is the character of the states? Well, this main pathway that we have is you go from a state which has one electron in this non-bonding metal d orbitals and one electron in this anti-bonding metal d orbitals. Actually goes to this doubly excited state and then goes back to another one of this, and from there we go to the ground state. So what we mainly have is we have a population of the anti-bonding EG orbitals, and what we could do is, if we would increase the ligand field splitting, the splitting between this energy levels would go up, and then this would actually not be stabilized, but it would actually destabilize and would maybe help us to get more population through the other pathways. So how could we do this? Well, if we would increase the metal ligand distances and also the trans angles, this would lead to destabilization of all the configurations where you have more electrons in this anti-bonding orbitals. So if we look at the complete mechanism, what would happen if you would increase the ligand field strength? Well, all the states which have electrons in the anti-bonding orbitals, they would increase in energy, and the more electrons they have there, the more they would increase in energy. So if you would increase the ligand field strength, this would increase by a lot, this would increase by a bit, this would increase by a bit, and the others, they would be left unchanged. So you could just think that maybe at the end we could have something like this. And now, because this is so much higher energy, this pathway is not as efficient anymore, and then more should go into these two pathways. And also because this relaxation is not possible anymore, maybe this is not sufficient, we can stabilize more population in the signet states here, and then at the end enhance the emission properties of the complex. Okay, basically this was the first example I wanted to show, and the next example is a complex that I'm studying right now with a master student in the group. She's also here in a seminar. I saw her before, and this is a rhenium complex, which has this modified bivalent ligand with this thio bridge. What you can use it is for excited state proton-coupled electron transfer. So at the end, you want to do some redox catalysis with it. What you do is you initially excite it at the rhenium, and you start with a metal to ligand charge transfer excitation, which moves an electron to one of the other ligands in the complex. And then you can let it interact with some sacrificial electron proton donor. And this can somehow give a proton. It's not quite clear yet where the proton really goes, but you can also give an electron back to the complex. And it's thought that at the end, you somehow transport then this extra electron that you had here also somehow to this ligand where you have this, where you took on this hydrogen atom. Yeah, and basically this is synthesized, and in the experiments you can also see the reaction, but it's not yet clear where the proton goes, and it's not yet. And what we are trying to study is not really the full reaction so far, but only like the first steps. How does the excitation proceed? Where does the electron go? Can it really work this way? Now, in this case, our metal is not an open shell anymore with a degenerate ground state, but it's rhenium D6, which has a closed shell signet ground state. So we're not really, we don't really have to use this very expensive multi-configuration and multi-reference methods, but we can also do, we can use single reference methods like time-dependent density function theory. And this is what we did. So we tried some functionals. At the end, we found that PBU0 gives a good description of the absorption spectrum. So here you see in green the experimental absorption spectrum. It has this band here and then this double peak. See, we also have this shoulder from the band here, and we don't have the double peak here. But if we look at how far away we are in energy from experiment, we see is already quite a good description, only 0.3, 0.6 electron volt difference from experiment. So it seems like PBU0 can give a good description of the excited states. But in this complex, it also fluoresces. So we thought we can also check the performance of a functional by calculating the emission spectrum. I show you here the experimental emission spectrum, and then when we calculate, so it has a band at around like 575 nanometers, and when we calculate, when we still search for the lowest triplet state and we calculate the emission energy, we get something that's all the way over here. So it's not part of the spectrum anymore, but it's 2000 wave numbers, so it's 1.6 electron volts off. And this was a really curious thing, because like normally you shouldn't expect such a huge error. So something seems to be wrong here. We tried other functionals which gave more or less the same energy and also gave the same geometry for this minimum. We also tried to not just calculate the energy here, but really try to compute the spectrum, including all the nuclear motion via Van quantum factors. And this shifts the vibrational resolved excitation somewhere to around 1000 nanometer, but it's still like 0.8 electron volts off. So we were still not really satisfied that this works. But then we thought, okay, now let's just start the dynamics and see where our system goes, and maybe we learn something from this. So for this, we initially did surface hopping dynamics using TDFT. So doing this ab initio on the fly, and not with this LVC approximation. And we see in the beginning, we excite to some excited signet state. Then we have population transfer mainly to a high lying triplet state, which is very fast, sub 50 femtoseconds. Something can still go back, and from there everything mainly goes to the triplet ground state at around 200 femtoseconds. And then also a fraction goes from this excited singlet states to the singlet, to the first excited singlet state. And yeah, when we now analyze what happens in the nuclear motion trajectories, we see that some trajectories they try to dissociate, so they go back, so they go towards this T1 minimum, which has a very elongated sulfur-sulfur bond. And these trajectories in red, while most of the trajectories, at least in this 100 femtosecond timescale that we simulated, they stay around the equilibrium value that we have in the beginning, so around 2.1 angstrom. And yeah, basically here you see one of the trajectories going towards this, one of the Z trajectories. You see mainly what happens is elongation of the sulfur-sulfur bond. While all the other trajectories, yeah, this bond stays more or less the same. They wiggle around a little bit, but they don't really do much in terms of nuclear motion. We thought like this looked like dissociation, so we cannot really describe it any further, but maybe there is a lot of population which could stay in this kind of geometries which don't dissociate. Maybe they are stable in this one. Maybe we could try to simulate them for longer times. Of course, now comes again the cost of such kind of simulations. So for this, what I showed you, we did with TDDFT, PB0 functional, triple zeta basis set, 15 singlets, 16 singlets, 15 triplet states, 100 trajectories for 100 femtoseconds, cost around 600,000 CPU hours. So this was already very expensive. So you cannot really go that much longer here, at least if you want to have a reasonable number of trajectories. But maybe for this non-dissociative trajectories, we could do LBC dynamics. So we parameterized an LBC model again. This time, because it's only TDDFT, it only took around 1,000 CPU hours. And then if you would want to simulate like the same number of trajectories as in with TDDFT, now this only costs 3 hours. So it's super fast. And yeah, but basically, because it's so cheap again, we didn't just do 100 and 400 femtoseconds. We also wanted to see for longer simulation times. So again, now if you want, you can do 2,000 trajectories, simulate for 10 picoseconds, and still only cost 6,000 CPU hours. Basically, when you look at the electronic populations, what electronic states do in the LBC dynamics, it's very similar. Only now, because we go to longer timescales, there is some internal conversion already from the S1 to the single ground state, which we didn't see in the TDDFT dynamics. But otherwise, also all the time constants that we fitted for the process, they are very similar to the TDDFT one. So it seems like at least this part is also well described by LBC. What we found here is, now I'll show you what the trajectories do. You see here, I plot the energy gap between the triplet one, the triplet ground state and the singlet ground state, and I plot it against the SS bond length. You see, initially, like you start at this region, but then most of the trajectories move in this region to longer bond length, but some part also stays here. So maybe here at some random time, you can see it better. Like you have most of the trajectories move to longer SS bond lengths, while some really stays at the shorter one. And then also, if you take some snapshots from the simulations of trajectories that are in this region, and you optimize them, you find again this T1 state that we looked at in the beginning with the elongated sulfur-sulfur bond. But you also find now a different one, which is if you take trajectories if you take some random snapshots from here and just optimize them, some of the trajectories go to a different triplet state, and this actually then has, so it's also a minimum, and this then has an emission energy which is very close to the experiment. And again, the other one was also very far off. So what we think now is that this emission that the complex shows is mainly due to some parts of the population that stay at this short sulfur-sulfur distances. And if you see, like if you now compare the emission maximum of the experimental spectrum versus our emission energy of this triplet T1 minimum, it's very, very close. So this already makes more sense than our 0.8 that we had even with different quantum factors. Now, our collaborators in Germany who studied experimentally the system, they also did some time-resolved spectroscopy experiments, which also seem to be, for which also our calculations seem to be in alignment. For example, they did time-resolved IR spectroscopy. Basically, you see here some negative peaks, which represents the CO frequencies of the ground state here and here, and then you see some positive peaks, which represent the CO vibrations in the excited state. And you see, so when you excite at some point, your frequency shifts. Now we can also calculate the CO frequencies from our ground state and from our excited states. What we find for the ground state here, so the CO frequencies, they are a little bit shifted to higher energies. Also, and then I show you here for this triplet ground, this first excited triplet state with the elongated sulfur bond, which is all shifted. But if you look at this region, for the excited states, you see kind of a splitting of this one band into two bands. And this is not really well produced here for this T long state. But if you calculate the frequencies for the other triplet minimum, you can really see now a larger splitting between these two frequencies, which seems to be in alignment with the experiment. If you look at what is the error, it's a rather systematic. So I draw like some parallel lines. Starting in here, you see this could maybe be a little bit more shifted to higher frequencies, but overall it gives the correct splitting, and it just seems to be a systematic error that you have for this for the frequencies of the T1 with the short distances. And in the meantime, we also tried to prolong our simulations for some trajectories a little bit. Sorry, this is the next slide. What we found also is there are also transient absorption experiments, which showed a cascade of 3 processes, and the first one appearing with the 0.3 picosecond time scale, and this seems also to be very close with this overall process going from the SN high excited single states to the triplet, to the lowest triplet states. The other process has also similar time constant, but since it's only a minor process, this is probably dominated by this mechanism. Now, when we go back and think about, we said some trajectories, they look like they dissociate. Can you really describe this with TDDFT? And of course, for this kind of complex, you cannot really compare to any multi-reference methods because they're just too expensive. So what we did is we just looked at the ligand, because all the motion when you go from quantum point to the T1 minimum only happens in the ligand. It's only basically this elongation of the sulfur-sulfur bond. And then we can compare CuSPT2 and TDDFT potential energy surfaces. And here you see in green, you see the ground state, and in blue you see the T1 state. Solid lines is the CuSPT2 potentials, while the dashed lines is the TDDFT potentials. See, they are kind of similar. The only thing is that with CuSPT2, with TDDFT, you get a crossing at around 2.8 angstrom, which is at the much shorter distances that you would get with CuSPT2. So it seems like CuSPT2 or TDDFT overestimates from when you could go from the T1 back to the single ground state. But otherwise, this region seems to be fine described. But we cannot really see this in the LVC dynamics, unfortunately, because if we plot the same potentials using our parameterized LVC model, we get this dotted lines, and there you see, because it's only a harmonic approximation, we cannot really describe going to much larger bond distances. So in our long-time ABC dynamics, we cannot really see any S1, S0, T1 crossing or anything going back to the ground state via the normal physical pathway. So ABC just gives crossings that are way too high. But since, let me show this back. But since there is this crossing, also with CASP2, which happens before you dissociate, we don't really have the problem that our TDFT trajectories, which seem like they really dissociate, they just go to these long distances, and from there they could go to the ground state at some point. So right now we're trying to see this. So we have some trajectories that we propagated further, but we're only at 150 femtoseconds so far. But maybe we'll see them if we find a promising trajectory. Yeah, but basically for this, you now need really to do this with TDFT, because in LVC, the potentials are completely wrong at this point. So you cannot see any T1 S0 crossing in this process. Okay, basically now I come to the conclusion. This will be very short because I already talked for long enough. So just to wrap it up, yeah, I've showed you a little bit about what we can do when we want to simulate excited dynamics, specifically for transition model complexes. It's always a bit more difficult than organic molecules because they are just by their nature simply larger, and most of the times they also have more electronic states which contribute. So you kind of need different approximations that you would introduce. Seeing that, like, if for the transition metal complexes, because they can have such a complicated electronic structure, sometimes you just have to stick to multi-reference methods, and then because of the size, it's just not possible to do it any other way than with LVC. And in this case, it also works very well. And then on the other example, I think it's a very nice showcasing of how you can combine some, let's say, more correct, more accurate ab initio molecular dynamics simulations with simulations based on this parameterized potentials. Then if you find out where each model breaks down, you can still get a lot of useful information from both types of simulations. Yeah, if this is interesting, of course, you can always come to me and ask me if you have a problem, how could we study this? But if you just want to read a little bit, I can advise you. We recently wrote a review in Jack's Code, which summarizes most of the theory and also gives you all the different examples of simulations for transition metal complexes. And if you want to learn more about this ABC stuff, we are just writing a review in Accounts of Chemical Research. So right now it's also under review. Hopefully this will come out soon. So you will also have a first point to go there and read about this. And then with this, I come to my last slide. I want to thank the Gonzalez group, especially, of course, the teacher, and then two students, Thomas and Julia, who did the work with me. I want to thank all my experimental collaborators in Germany, especially the groups of Katja Heinze, von Meyer, and Dirk Schwarzer, the German Research Foundation for sponsoring my work, and of course, I want to thank you all for your kind attention. Thank you.
Thank you, Patrick. Very, very nice talk.
Yes.
A very good panorama of what can be done and how to do it. Thank you very much.
Yeah. Should I still share my screen, or because then I don't see you?
I don't know. Maybe you can use the slides for answering some questions.
Yes.
Okay. So it's open for questions now. Please, you can ask now, please, questions. Patrick is waiting for a lot of questions, please. No questions? Well, I'm going to open this. Okay, I think there is one. Oh, yes, Sebastian. Okay, Sebastian, it's your time. Go ahead.
Hey, Patrick.
Hi, Sebastian.
Thanks for the nice talk, even though I already know a part of that, of course. So you showed these two different triplet minima for the complex of Julia.
Mm-hmm.
And I was wondering, because you said that the emission spectrum fits much better to the T1 short than the T1 long, Did you ever try to compute the oscillator strengths for these two minima, including spin-orbit couplings and stuff?
I mean, we have oscillator strengths. We didn't look at them, but
I mean, obviously, you would need to calculate the spin-orbit, including oscillator strengths, because otherwise they're just zero.
yes, yeah, we didn't do this yet, but that's actually a good idea.
Because that could explain why you see emission only from the T1 short and not from the T1 long, even though I don't know which of the two minima is lower in energy.
I mean, lower in energy is the T1 long, which is at 2000 nanometers, so it's 0.5 electron volts, which is just completely off.
Yeah.
But based on this potential energy scans, we think that if you go to this T long, you are already quite close to some crossing, even if it's longer with CASF, CASP2, and since it's all very flat, from this T long, you should also be able to go non-radiatively to the ground state. So that's why we think only the T1 short is responsible for the emission spectrum.
Yeah, but if that's lower in energy and goes back non-radiatively, then it might be that you don't see anything at all. So there should be some reason that you go back to the T1 short and emit there.
Yeah. Now we just assume that some part of the population gets trapped in the T1 short and at the end radiates, while everything else that goes via the T1 long then also should have the chance to go non-radiatively to the ground state.
Yeah. Although experimentally, maybe there would be emission at this wavelengths. Usually you don't measure on such a wide range.
Yeah, this also, we talked about this in our last discussion with the experimentalists, and they say they want to check this again because they also didn't think about this. That's true.
Okay, cool, thanks.
Okay. Next question, please. Okay, so Patrick, I remember that in the early works of with CASP2 and transition metals, we always worry about the double D shell. What do you have to have you used it? I don't think you have used double D shells. Are they important for dynamics or?
Yes, I looked into the literature when I started studying this because I also had heard of this, but actually it's only thought to be important if you have excited states where the occupation of the d orbital changes. So if you have some metal to ligand excited state where you remove one electron from the d orbitals and put it onto the ligand. But since this was not the case for this vinyl complex, because all the states, they were either metal-centered by themselves or this one state, which is basically ligand-centered. So we thought it's not really necessary to include the second D shell. Also, then even the parameterization, I mean, if you include 5 more orbitals, probably not 20,000, but like 200,000 or 300,000 core hours. So this already becomes very expensive.
Okay.
What we did is we also calculate, so we checked all the CASF energies also against CASP2, and they agreed very well, only like 0.2, 0.3 electron volts off. So this seems like CASF gives a reasonable description of these states.
Okay. Okay. Another question. You have used the time-dependent DFT, okay, for at least in this work. And I remember that some time ago I don't know exactly how it came to my mind, but I've heard that ADC2 does not work very well for these transition metals, especially ruthenium or things like that. Do you know why?
Actually, no, I don't know why. I mean, so I know from personal accounts also that this usually fails, but so far, like no one has really written a paper about this, which is kind of a shame because like it's not really understood. Probably, I know that with ADC3, this gets better. So you have to include the double excitations at yeah, but really why this is, I don't know so far.
But it doesn't work at all, or just in some case it doesn't work? I mean, the ADC2. It's a rule. I mean, don't use ADC2.
Yeah, I would say, like, as a rule, is probably if you want to use single reference methods for transition metals, you should stick with some functional that works. But I mean, of course, you can always, with ADC2, it's the easy thing is you just do one calculation and then you see at least if the spectrum is good or not. So this is it's very easy to test.
Yes. Yeah. Okay. 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 Thank you, Patrick. Any other questions, Danilo? So, okay. There is Sebastian. Okay, Sebastian, please.
Then I just ask something else. So you showed these different occupation patterns for the vanadium states. It's nice. I think it's just the previous slide. Even though on this slide one can't really see it well. There were different kinds of states. I think it's the... Can you make this larger, please? Sorry. Yes. Yes. So you have the green states and you have the dark blue states, and both of them have one electron in the T2G and one electron in the EG. They're quite different in energy. There is even this double excited state in between. So have you some idea what differentiates these two kind of states?
No, I don't know. But it's also, like, if you look at what experimentalists do, they have this Tanabo-Sugano diagrams. And this also predicts this two kinds of different, two terms belonging to the same configuration, or showing similar configurations actually at different energies. If you really go into octahedral symmetry, you will see also that they have different symmetry. So one is a T2 and the other is a T1 state. So this sketch is just based on natural orbital occupation numbers and does not really show all these different linear combinations of the actual configurations. So it's a bit more complicated than I show here, but this is just if you would go from analyzing all the states based on the natural orbital occupation numbers, you will get a picture like this. And based on this, you can think about if something is possible by including only single excitations or not. I mean, we also did the calculations with DDDFT, and there we basically saw exactly all the states that I crossed out here. They are just missing. So this state you don't find, this state you don't find, this state you don't find, these states you don't find, and these states here, they are at much too high energy in DDDFT.
Okay. Yeah, it was basically what I expected, that there are some weird linear combinations that kind of give rise to different states, but yeah. Okay, thanks.
But you use the symmetry just for discussion, not for running the calculations, okay?
Yeah, exactly, yes.
Yes, okay. Danilo?
Yeah. Hey, Patrick. In the first work, you parameterize the LVC parameters at the KZCF level, right? It's possible to use, for example, the MRG to do that, because in this case we could include all orbitals.
Yes, in principle, yes. The thing is, so for an n-atomic system, you need about 6 n calculations. So if your transition metal complex has only 30 atoms, this is already 180 calculations that you need to do. So you would need to run 180 DMRT calculations. Right? If you can do this, then you have DMRT LVC potentials. It's very nice. The other thing that could be possible in the future is if we get non-adiabatic couplings with DMRT. because then the 6 n calculations can be done in just a single calculation. So yeah, then you could do just one very, very, very expensive DMRG calculation, but you would have all the parameters from one calculation. But I could picture this in the future.
Okay, in the future. Okay, thanks.
Yeah, but the problem is DMRG calculations are very, very expensive. And it's very hard to do that.
Yeah, but if you only need to do one, and
Yes.
then maybe you are fine to wait a month to get your parameters, and then for the actual simulations, you can do this in 2 days then. So now it's not so much doing the simulations that takes 2 months, but then it would be doing the parameterization that takes 2 months, and then simulation is very, very, very cheap.
But I mean, think about our conditions, the computers we have here. I mean, it's for us. I think it would be difficult. Well, let's see. Any other question, please? Curiosity, comments? No? So, if there is no more questions, I thank you again, Patrick, for the nice seminar and to share with us your knowledge or your background. It was a very, very interesting seminar. I mean, the results, the time you used to run the calculations, you gave us a very good panorama about the situation. Thank you very much. Thank you very much.
Yeah, you're welcome. Thank you very much for the invitation.
And congratulations for the work you have done.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, and I hope to meet you soon again in the next seminar that's going to be in 2 weeks. Okay, I will send you and everybody a new message about the next seminar. Thank you, Patrick. Thank you all for being with us today. So, see you soon. Have a nice evening for those who are in Europe and a nice afternoon for us in Brazil. See you. Thank you, Patrick.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.